Okay, so lastly, I want to go over some of Marshall's laws. So we talked a little bit about the demand for leisure and the supply of labor, but I wanted to talk more specifically about the demand for labor. So if we look at the demand for labor, um, the elasticity of that demand for labor is a function of a couple different things, specifically for Marshall's law. So, for example, um, one of Marshall's laws are that it depends on the elasticity of substitution for factors of production, right? Um, which is represented by this symbol right here. This is elasticity of substitution for factors of production. So essentially, if we're looking at labor, right, and we take the elasticity of substitution, let's pretend the elasticity of substitution is very high for for capital. That means that essentially, given a 1 unit change in the price of labor, a 1 unit change in the wage, right, could be because of which could be because of unionization, minimum wage legislation. That may result in fluctuations in the consumption for said factor production, right? So if the price of labor increases by 1 unit, right, then given a perfectly substitutable given that capital and labor are perfectly substitutable, you could easily substitute capital and consume less of labor, right? Consume with obviously, but so yeah, that would enhance the substitution effect. So which would essentially largely determine the elasticity demand for labor. Now, if we want to look at the supply elasticity of the supply of the other factors of production, again, let's take a similar example, right? The elasticity of supply, given a perfectly elastic supply curve for, say, capital, right? That would essentially entail, um, or actually, wait, let's take perfectly inelastic in this scenario, just because, right? That means that regardless of changes in the rental wage, or I'm sorry, the rental price of capital, the firm would essentially supply the same amount of the same quantity supplied of capital. So in that sense, right, given a high elasticity of supply for the other factor production being capital, the substitution effect would typically be more pronounced for a 1 unit change in the wage, right? All right, let's move on to the next one. These are sort of would enhance the scalar effects, which we'll talk more about later. The elasticity of let's look at the elasticity of demand for the final product. So, um, if you want to look at the elasticity of demand for final product, if you look at industries that typically provide elastic versus inelastic goods, I know one off the top of my head, one industry that provides a relatively inelastic that has essentially a relatively inelastic demand curve would be, for example, the gasoline industry, like maybe Exxon or something like that. Um, but anyways, given if we want to talk about those with very elastic demand curves for the final product, if we take a 1 unit change in price for that product, right? If it's very elastic, that'll potentially lead to fluctuations in consumption for that final product. And given the fluctuations in consumption, that could potentially lead to fluctuations in the demand for inputs, right? So there are a number of different inputs for gasoline, right? Being crude oil, for example. So that input could fluctuate, right? The consumption for that input could fluctuate. So essentially, that would in turn affect the elasticity of demand for crude oil. Now, look at the last one. They'll propose another scalar effect. We have the proportion of factor cost in the total cost of production. Obviously, if labor is a significant cost for firms, right? If it's a high proportion, right, of factor costs, right, then a change in the wage potentially as a result of all sorts of legislation or things like that, or there could be structural problems that would prevent the real wage from going down to that equilibrium, that long run equilibrium. Um, Essentially, that could result in a number of different scale effects. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this by essentially drawing a graph for you guys. So, okay, we have labor and capital. Okay, so if this is our ISO cost curve and the price of labor has effectively doubled, so if we are, say, for example, if we're here and, okay, if we're here and our new bundle is over here, right? Um, Essentially, if we superimpose the new ISO cost curve onto the old indifference curve, let's just make this a little bit more pronounced. Then, okay, so intersect at about over here, right? So, given this specific delineation of preferences for the firm, right? Remember, firms typically like to cost minimize and they want to cost minimize while at the same time producing a given number of output, right? Um, it would intersect the old indifference curve at this point. So the substitution effect would be over here, right? So effectively, they're going to, as a result of the relative attractiveness of each factor production, they're going to consume less labor and more capital, or substitute less labor for more capital. And the income effect would essentially be from this point to the new bundle, right? So they would be both going in the same direction. The total effect is comprises both of them, right? So specifically, what's happening, right? So given one of the Marshall's laws we talked about, if we talked about the elasticity to substitution for that's one. Remember, that's one of the fundamental determinants for elasticity demand for an input is elasticity of substitution for factors of production, right? So if it's a very elastic substitution for factors of production, right? That would essentially enhance the substitution effect. So from here to here would be more pronounced because we could easily substitute less labor for more capital, which is what they're doing over here, right? So that would be a more practical example of what I was talking about. Now, if we look at essentially the elasticity of the supply of the other factors of production, right? Given a more elastic supply of, say, capital, you can also easily substitute less labor for more capital. So that would be another fundamental determinant that would enhance the substitution effect, right? Um, uh, Proportion of factor cost in the total cost of production. Now, if labor is a high proportion of cost in the holistic perspective of the production process, right? That would essentially behoove the firm to scale back on their production because in real terms, if they want to cost minimize, they need to find better ways to use their resources efficiently, right? So if they want to find better ways to use their resources efficiently, right, they would scale back to consume less labor and less capital, given that labor and capital are both normal goods, right? And that's what's happening here with this income effect, right? Or actually, I shouldn't say income effect. You see, I'm still on the other one. I should say, I'm sorry, this is actually a scalar effect, right? Scalar effect is more pronounced. Um, Now, let's look at one of the other Marshall's laws, the elasticity of demand for the final good, right? If the elasticity of demand for final good is typically very elastic, that would behoove the firm to also have a more sensitive elasticity of demand for the factors of production through a higher scalar effect. So they typically scale back production altogether because of that high elasticity of demand for the final commodity, right? So this is just more of a practical interpretation of how one unit change in labor, right? How consumption would fluctuate based off of these different fundamental determinants or predictors of elasticity of demand for labor. And this is what's so fascinating with this is one of the most prominent determinants for labor economics, right? Because if we want to look at employment, if we want to look at class action lawsuits, right? The last the one of those prominent pieces of evidence is used by essentially examining the elasticity of demand for our factors of production. So this is very practical. Marshall's laws. It was essentially made by it was essentially made by Alfred Marshall many years ago, but it's still used to this day. So I just wanted to talk about that. So I hope you guys have a good time on the final. Any questions, you know my email, and Godspeed. So yeah.